Before we get to this week's episode, this is just a reminder that if you sign up to my email list by going to go.nonmonogamyhelp.com/email, you do automatically get sent a coupon code that you can use for the Anxious Person's Guide to Non-Monogamy on the Jessica Kingsley Publishers website. And they do ship to North America and to Europe, as far as I know, also all around the world, but do feel free to join the email list and get that coupon in case you want to get the book, but you want to get a little bit of money off. All right, this is this week's episode.
Non-Monogamy Help is a podcast where your questions about open, non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships are answered. Our host, Lola Phoenix, will consult a licensed therapist with over a decade of experience to address your problems. Names and locations have been changed or censored to keep your questions anonymous. You're listening to Non-Monogamy Help, the podcast.
Hello, and welcome to episode 100 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. I'm Lola Phoenix. Amazing 100 episodes. I can't even wrap my head around that. Anyway, please send your questions to nonmonogamyhelp@gmail.com and they'll either be read in the podcast or the column anonymously. If you want to read the columns and listen to the podcast, you can go to nonmonogamyhelp.com, and you can also go to nonmonogamyhelp.com/email to subscribe to the email newsletter, and you get all of the columns and the podcasts in your inbox so you don't miss anything. And you can follow us, or me, on Twitter and Instagram at nonmonogamyhelp. If you want to support what I'm doing here, it's 100th episode, I can speak today. Please consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month helps me with the daily running of the columns of the podcast, and it just shows me a general vote of support. I'd really, really appreciate that. You can do that by going to patreon.com/Lola Phoenix. And if you donate $5 or more a month, your name with your permission will be read at the end of the podcast. Before we get to the question, let's get to the discussion question. If this is the first episode you're hearing, every week before I read the letter, I put forth a discussion question that you can use with your friends, partners, or anyone else to get to know them a little bit more. And I also answer it myself briefly to give you a little bit of context. This week's discussion question is: what is a monogamous-centric societal value that is passed into your practice of non-monogamy? This is going to be relevant to the letter today, of course, but I think it's worth you thinking about what kind of things monogamous-centric society taught you that passed into your practice of non-monogamy or polyamory. And for me, it was the idea that romantic love is more important, more valuable than any other kind of relationship, and that hookups and things like that were obviously less valuable. And yeah, I believed that, and that kind of informed how I went into non-monogamy, and it informed my assumptions of how I felt about my partner's relationships when I had partners, and it wasn't necessarily accurate. The idea that just because you hook up with somebody, that means you don't care about them as much as someone that you love or maybe see for longer periods of time is not really true. But it's something that our monogamous-centric society has taught us, and it's something that we can continue to kind of perceive within a non-monogamy structure, because we might think, oh, well, if this person is just someone you hook up with, then that must be not as important as me. I don't need to feel challenged by that. And sometimes that, helps you because you don't feel as challenged, but sometimes it's worth thinking about, and it's worth breaking that down a little bit and thinking about it a little bit more. So yeah, that is this week's discussion question. Let me read it again. What is a monogamous-centric societal value that passed into your practice of non-monogamy? Let's get to this week's letter.
I'm in partnership with two people who are monogamous, and one person has been doing some serious work to unpack and unlearn and just make serious decisions about whether or not we can and want to do this. The other person is happy to be with me, but is not really doing some of the emotional work to be in a polyamorous relationship while they are believing in monogamy as the way that life happens. And while that sounds completely ridiculous, I am so enamored and fascinated with them because we share this really big dream of building community. And so recently they've shared with me that they're reinforcing a rule that the spaces that we're building and creating are only available to strangers and platonic relationship partners. Romantic partners are not allowed. And I was under the impression that this was about our living space, or like a land base that we are living on consistently. But they outlined to me that this is the entire world. They're in the entire world, all of the things that we ever build. No one who I am romantically interested in is allowed ever in the entire world in any of these spaces. And that feels bad. I wanted to elaborate that it absolutely feels bad. And one of my friends who is also ethically non-monogamous believes that it's fair to give people time to unlearn and to recognize how they could be being harmful in their long-standing beliefs of monogamy. And I think my question is like, is that real? Like, do we allow people to unpack and unlearn and move at their own pace? Or do we acknowledge things that could mean that there's not a future for collaboration and change, and that we just accept that some people are monogamous, and though they might fall in love with or choose to love or stand in love with people who love abundantly, that the constriction that monogamy experiences in loving ways, I think that probably feels weird to even say, like that's just a norm that some people are not going to shift, even though they may profess to understand that they're in partnership with people who are polyamorous. This particular partner is like a isolated genius. She's brilliant and has literally no community, and is comfortable resorting to community that shares maybe one identity, but that might shun other parts of her identity. I feel like it would be really healthy for her to find community, and if that's not available, I've suggested therapy so that she has someone to vent or to talk to, or to just start to unpack and really like delve into some heart work. But because she's so focused on the community building aspect that we're doing, which does take a lot of time and energy and money, and literally all of our energetic resources, the mental health care is not a priority. It feels confusing to me that I see there that she feels in competition with the partner I've been with for nearly 3 years, because she thinks that it's like a sex thing or it's something other thing. But it's really about how can we be most healthy together.
Before we get to this week's answer, I'm going to quickly plug this episode's sponsor, BetterHelp. Quite often in a lot of my columns and my podcasts, I tell people to seek a polyamory-friendly therapist because therapy is super important. And for a lot of people looking locally for a therapist who may be supportive or even understanding of polyamory can be impossible or out of their budget, BetterHelp allows you to find therapists online you can send messages to at any time of the day. They do offer some financial aid. You can also switch therapists if one isn't working out for you. You can get 10% off your first month by using the promo code Non-Monogamy Help at checkout, or going to betterhelp.com/non-monogamy help. Let's get to this week's answer. There are a few things about your question that I want to challenge you on, because I see this perspective quite frequently in polyamory and non-monogamy. And I think that this perspective, even if it's not intentionally trying to make monogamous people feel bad, the result is often that monogamous people feel understandably judged by it. And I feel like that's not the intention, but it is worth really unpacking this. The first thing that I kind of want to challenge you on is that monogamy isn't a belief. Like, I get really frustrated with polyamorous people who say they don't believe in monogamy. And I understand that what they mean is that they don't believe monogamy, quote unquote, works. And I think that it's ironic that a lot of non-monogamous people say this because their judgment of what quote unquote works means is very based on monogamous-centric culture. This idea is that because people don't stay in monogamous relationships until one person in that relationship dies, that those relationships are a failure is a very monogamous-centric belief that a lot of people are challenging. Just because a relationship ends doesn't mean that the people who are in it have failed. And this is something that I really agree with Dan Savage on, and I think is something that no matter what your relationship structure is, you should really, really challenge within yourself the idea that a relationship must last until a person who is in it has died in order for it to be considered a quote-unquote success. People divorcing, people breaking up, and even people committing adultery or cheating on one another isn't an inherent failure of that relationship, nor does it necessarily need to stand as a representation of whether or not monogamy quote unquote works. So it's very ironic to me that a lot of polyamorous people and a lot of non-monogamous people have this idea that monogamy doesn't quote unquote work, that they don't believe in they don't believe in monogamy based off of a judgment of what quote unquote works that has been ingrained in them by a monogamous centric culture, which isn't fair to judge any relationship standard on. So monogamy in and of itself is purely a choice to have one romantic partner. That can be based within certain assumptions that monogamous-centric culture encourages people to believe, but it is not necessarily an inherent part of being monogamous. Compare this to gender, okay? Being a woman or identifying as a woman does not necessarily mean that you believe that women are inferior or all of any other sorts of sexist, shitty things that society says that come with the label of woman. You don't necessarily believe that women have to wear dresses. Maybe you enjoy being feminine. Maybe you find identity within that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you think that everyone should be feminine. I think quite a lot of times people mistake the practice of monogamy with all of the things that society tacks on to monogamy. And quite often when they criticize quote unquote monogamy, what they're criticizing are things like that being jealous is a sign that you love someone, or all of the other sorts of things that quite a lot of monogamous people are challenging today. So that is the first thing that I would really challenge you on. It is not an inherent thing that people have to unlearn, and people can still prefer monogamy and challenge those monogamous-centric beliefs that society has taught them. This sort of perspective that monogamy is some sort of programmed state that people are within culture, that it is an inherent ignorance and that one must unlearn and unpack this ignorance, and the only logical place for one to end up after unpacking this ignorance is polyamory or a preference for polyamory, is very, very insulting to the intelligence of monogamous people. It's very, very crappy, to be honest with you. It's not true. A lot of people can challenge monogamous-centric culture and still be monogamous in the same way that people can challenge our heterocentric culture without becoming gay. It's not something that people are going to shift necessarily. And monogamy and polyamory, I can't tell you if they're inherent orientations or not. I don't know. Personally, for me, it feels like I can choose either one. That's my personal perspective. But for some people, it does feel like it's an inherent part of them, and I'm not going to criticize them on that or challenge them on that. So I really think that this idea that monogamy itself is something that people have to unpack and unlearn, and that the natural result of someone challenging their jealousy or whatnot is them becoming polyamorous is not true, and is something that you really, really should think about. wanting to be monogamous to a polyamorous person isn't a result of a lack of unlearning. There are quite a lot of people who want to date polyamorous people who want to be monogamous in themselves, and that's a preference. And it might not be something you can wrap your head around, and that's fine. As an agender person, I don't wrap my head around having a gender identity. I don't get it. That doesn't mean that people who have one are wrong, or that they are ignorant or need to unpack their ignorance to reach the state of non-genderness. So I think that you need to maybe understand that monogamous people are sometimes people that have challenged certain beliefs, and maybe they won't be perfect with all of it, just like polyamorous people are not perfect. A lot of polyamorous people still have those monogamous-centric beliefs that they've brought over and that they still have within polyamory. It's not this sort of like conversion experience that you seem to kind of think that it is. So it's a preference that they have. And monogamous preferences aren't inherently harmful. Monogamous preferences aren't inherently ignorant. And monogamous-centric culture, just as, the things that we have been taught about almost everything, even therapy. Like, the reason I encourage people to get therapy is because we live in a culture that has for a very long time encouraged people to believe that therapy is bad, that telling people, especially men, telling people how you feel is not something you should do, that you should be ashamed of your feelings. Like, there's a lot about our culture that people have to unlearn, and there isn't anything inherent to the practice of monogamy that is harmful in and of itself, just like there's nothing inherent to having a gender identity that is harmful within itself. And a lot of people, break down and challenge these assumptions without changing their identities or what they want to do. Monogamy can be and is an abundant love. And I understand, again, that you're probably trying to construct this in a certain way linguistically, but to construct the idea that polyamory is loving abundantly is sort of conversely making a judgment about monogamy. And I think it's very judgmental and unnecessarily so. We don't need to do such a thing. Now, when it comes to this person that you're dating, their decision to not enter into certain communities or wanting to build their own community is understandable. And maybe they don't want therapy. This is all decisions that they need to make for themselves. And it is odd for someone to decide what sounds like that they want to construct a community which is supposed to somehow encompass the whole world, which seems a little bit odd to me, but maybe there's something about it I'm not understanding. And that they don't want you to bring any of your romantic partners within that. And within a polyamorous relationship, that is a little bit unrealistic, but I do think that for someone who's grown up in a monogamous-centric culture and pretty much wants monogamy, that is somewhat understandable, and I understand why you don't understand that. I think that it's a request that you could argue is not fair to make, but at the same time, you are also free to say no to that request. And not understanding how to balance one's feelings of jealousy while dating a polyamorous person isn't a result of being unenlightened. And that is something that if someone is wanting to be monogamous to a polyamorous person, I do think that there are things that they're going to have to accept and understand, because there is a competition here. I understand that you from your perspective, you might feel like, oh, there's no competition. That's not how this works. But understand that as abundant as you think your love is, and I'm sure it is, but there are only 24 hours in a day. On a very basic level, this person, the people who agree to be in a relationship with you, whether they agree to be monogamous to you or not, they have to understand that they are agreeing to a situation where they will not get 100% of your time in the same way that they would get more of your time if you were monogamous to them. And that is a difficult thing that a lot of people who are not familiar with polyamory might not really understand, that they're agreeing to that until the kind of fit hits the shan, for lack of a better term. Like, they don't really get it in the same way that some people agree to long distance relationships without understanding how being in a long distance relationship will feel. And then when they're in that long distance relationship, they try and make it work and it doesn't work. So I think that the kind of biggest quote unquote mistake or for lack of a better word, it's something that happens to people who are unfamiliar with polyamory. And it's not because they're stuck on jealousy or anything like that, but it's because they're used to monogamy, and because the monogamy is the relationship model that has been sold to them for whatever reason. There are people who, if they challenge themselves a little bit and step outside of the box, might not want monogamy. But that is a journey that they have to take themselves. It's not a journey that you can take for them. And if they agree to be monogamous to you, they may be monogamous to you in their own practice, but they have to respect the fact and understand the fact that you are not monogamous to them. And I think that this request, this idea of like, I'm going to build this community and you're not allowed to bring your partners into it, is a little bit unrealistic. And it's sort of analogous to the idea of like, if you were monogamous, being like, you can't bring anyone you've ever had a crush in or bring anyone who you've ever dated before. In some communities, that would actually be really easy because people don't necessarily talk that much to their exes or things like that. But in some communities where people don't really talk to their exes or see their exes, this isn't necessarily an unreasonable thing. So I think that this request is something that is kind of like the idea of not being friends with your exes anymore. For some people, this would not be a difficult thing because they don't really have that. For other people, especially in LGBTQ communities, in smaller communities, and the polyam community tends to be quite small in a lot of places, it's not really realistic to say, oh, you can't be friends with your ex or you can't ever talk to your ex, because usually your ex is like at all the events, etc., and so forth. And that may not be something that this person really understands. And I think that it's worth remembering, though, that yes, because this person is monogamous, they may not necessarily be familiar with that sort of idea of confronting the fact that their partner is with somebody else. But also that their fear in that is kind of rooted in truth. She is in competition with the other people that you're dating because you only have 24 hours in your day and you can't give all of your time to her, no matter how abundant, again, that you think your love is. And I'm sure it is. I'm not judging you, but she is in competition with those other people in one way or another, and may feel like she is. And that is a very valid feeling. So it does make sense that maybe what she is requesting, instead of it seeming like, oh, you can't bring any of your partners in here, maybe what she wants is to have the community that you create together to be something that's just for you too. And I think that sometimes things like that, even amongst people who are polyamorous, sometimes things like that can help when people feel like there is no relationship escalator. And if you're not familiar with that concept, I definitely recommend you look it up. When you don't have these milestones within a relationship where, okay, we've been together, we move in together, we get a dog together, or things like that make you feel more secure within one another. Sometimes a lot of polyamorous people will do something like, oh, I'll only go to theme parks with you, or I'll only do this thing with you, or Friday night is our date night. Like, some people create some type of thing that's just for them both, because that can kind of make them feel a little bit more secure. Perhaps this is kind of where she's coming from. It's less of trying to control you and more like, I want to create this community with you, and I would like that just to be for us too. I don't want there to be complications in it. I want to enjoy this community space without having to worry about being reminded of the fact that I don't have all of your time. And there might be some part of this that's denial. There might be some aspect of this that is denial, which does happen a lot of times for people who choose to be monogamous to a polyamorous person. It's a little bit out of sight, out of mind, a little bit don't ask, don't tell in some instances, because if they don't have to see your other partners, then they can kind of believe within their brain that you're monogamous to them. The biggest question here for me, though, is that despite all of the work that you're doing towards yourself, towards health, why are you consistently choosing people who tell you that they are monogamous and that they want monogamy, and you're basically still choosing that situation? You're choosing a situation where you know somebody isn't familiar with polyamory. You're choosing a situation where almost like you think you can change people, you can help them unpack all of this, you can help them awaken themselves to this new life. And that is something that you might want to explore. Why do you choose to be in relationships with people who want monogamy? What is it about that attracts you? What is it that makes you not walk away? And I know that you said like this person is very interesting to you, you're very enamored by them. I totally understand that. But there has to be something within yourself that goes, I am polyamorous. This person is monogamous. We don't want the same things. We are incompatible, even if we seem compatible. And I'm going to walk away because I know that I will eventually be more hurt by this, even if I'm not hurt now. There's not something in your brain that's doing that. I feel like there's something in your brain that's going, maybe even more interested in people that you think you can change. And that might be something that you might want to think about, because that's kind of the bigger question here, is not will monogamous people ever change, but why do you continue to choose people who have to change in the first place? And that's something that you might need to work on a little bit, because there isn't a point really in some ways in choosing someone who has a very different idea of a relationship, because at some point there is, going to be a shit hits the fan, fit hits the shan moment where the rubber's going to meet the road and it's not going to work. In the same exact way of somebody who really wants kids choosing people who say they don't want kids. There is a fundamental difference here in how you choose to live your life. And you are deciding, these people are telling you they're monogamous. It's not a secret. And you're deciding to stay anyway. And that is something that needs to be unpacked a little bit more. Maybe there isn't necessarily this idea that the monogamous people you're dating need to change. Maybe you need to change who you decide to stay with. And even if you're attracted to somebody, maybe you need more control within yourself to step away from a relationship that won't serve you, even if you're attracted to somebody, because you know that in the long term you will be hurt. And there is kind of a tendency in some people to choose relationships that they know won't work, because in some ways that means that they avoid intimacy. It is an avoidance of intimacy in some instances, and it's also somewhat comforting to them. As odd as that seems, sometimes choosing a relationship won't work, it is somewhat comforting. And maybe you feel comforted by the fact that you're polyamorous and this person's monogamous, and you've constructed this sort of perspective that you know more than them, you are somewhat more enlightened to them. They're the ones that need to unpack their shit. They're the ones that need to work themselves out, and not you. And maybe you feel comfortable in that. Maybe that's more comfortable for you than dating someone who is polyamorous and knows it, and then, who knows what's going to happen then. Maybe that feels, if you're constructing monogamy as this belief that needs to be challenged and worked through, maybe it's actually more comforting for you to be the one who's already worked through that than if you were to date someone who is polyamorous and maybe they're in a higher echelon of having broken down all of their monogamy feelings, and now you're the one who needs to work on yourself. So that might be something that you want to think about. Why do you choose these relationships? Why are you choosing to be with monogamous people when you know that you will face these challenges? Is it part of an avoidance of intimacy? Is it part of an avoidance of, wanting to have a little bit more power in the way that you perceive monogamy? So yeah, to sum up, I do think that you need to challenge some of your perspectives on monogamy and the way that you're constructing this. I don't think you're intending it to sound judgmental or you're intending to judge, but the way that you're constructing this is how do I make a comparison? The way that you are constructing this almost feels a little bit like almost a little bit religious in a way, almost a little bit fundamentalist in a way. And the idea that there are people who haven't yet worked through, haven't yet accepted the Savior, haven't yet we're all, all of us are sinners, but some people are more sinners than others. And some people have to work through it. Like, I know that this isn't what you mean, but when you construct the belief this way, it is a kind of a membership, and a kind of, I've become a better member than you, or and that will set you up for failure, actually, because again, like you're assuming that monogamy is an inherently harmful thing, an inherently ignorant choice, and that you're creating this binary of the enlightened versus the unenlightened, and that is always going to be more harmful for you in the long run, because you will always then have this anxiety about being the unenlightened. And so I think that's worth thinking about. I do think that the request that your partner has makes sense, is kind of unrealistic in some aspects, but it really depends on the context that they're putting across this request. For some people, this would not be a problem. For other people, it would. It's okay if it's a problem for you. You can walk away from this request. You don't have to honor it. And it doesn't have to be necessarily that they need to work on themselves. If this is a request that they have, then it might be something that someone else could honor. So that's worth thinking about. And it may not come from a place of wanting to control you. It may come from a place of wanting to have something between you that is just yours, which is something that even people who are polyamorous do tend to sometimes want within relationships as a way to make up for the lack of the relationship escalator. And last but not least, the biggest question here really is to examine why it is that you continuously choose monogamous people, and what that might mean for you, and what that might say about your own fears and your own assumptions within relationships. So yeah, I hope that helps, and good luck. Thank you for listening to episode 100 of Non-Monogamy Help. Holy crap. If you want to be awesome, you can donate to my Patreon. Donating $5 or more means that, and it's 100 episodes in, and I'm still struggling with this. Maybe I should rewrite it. Donating $5 or more means your name with your permission will be read at the end of the podcast. This week's current patrons are Laura Boylan, Chris Albury Jones, Juke, Ellen Robertson, Nikki Jones, James Wartell, Leo Yaki, and Tyler Tigno. If for whatever reason you can't become a patron because life happens, if you can take 5 minutes, log into iTunes, find the podcast, rate and review it. You can also do that on Spotify. That would be really, really helpful for me. It helps me get the podcast out there. And there's been 100 episodes, so I feel like you have definitely enough to judge the podcast on. If you want to just do a rating and not write a review, that's also appreciated. And if you do write a review, then let me know on Instagram or on Twitter. I have like some alerts for the reviews, but I really do appreciate them. They're really, really lovely. And thank you if you've been listening since episode 1. Wow. I can't even fathom that. I really enjoy doing the podcast. I really enjoy having the column. I can't believe that it's been going for this long. I was quite surprised when I started this that the letters kept coming in. I'm really happy that the letters keep coming in. I'm obviously not happy that you're having problems, but I'm very happy to help out. And I really hope one day that this can be just my full-time job, and I can just do this for a living. That would be amazing. But as it stands now, it's just me and my little microphone and my little laptop, and me scheduling the tweets and all that. And so it's just me. I don't have any help with things just yet. I can't afford help with things just yet, but it's 100 episodes. We'll see where we are by episode 200. How about that? We'll have a check-in. Episode 200, I'll play this back and we'll see what's changed. So yeah, thank you again. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you if you're a Patreon. I can't say thank you enough. You will get a new column. I think there will be a break after this. There's usually a break, a week break, and then I think after that you get a column and then another podcast episode after that. So not a fortnight, 3 weeks, but you'll get episode 101 then. Thank you so much for listening and for being a part of this journey. And yeah, thanks for everything. You've been listening to Non-Monogamy Help. The music was done by Chris Albury Jones at albury-jones.com. Our podcast art was done by Dom Young at domduong.com. Thank you again for listening.